Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this continuing discussion related to our FACSID. And so if you were with us with the prior discussion, you know who our FACSID is and you know some dynamics related to our FACSID. You also understand this dynamic of suppression that we've addressed. Now, what we're going to be looking at now is not only what Scripture has shown us about the descendants of our FACSID, but what history has confirmed. And so this discussion is going to focus on the title, the topic, the bad boys. What we see is that the bad boys have gone by many names throughout history. And so by going by all of these different names, all of these translations and iterations, it sometimes obscures exactly who we are talking about with respect to the bad boys. And there's one name or one transliteration that has been applied to the bad boys. And if you understand this construct, it helps to better understand what Scripture is actually saying about the bad boys. And so some of the names that you might see that are basically the foundations for these other iterations, you might see Apiru, Habiru, Hapiru, and essentially these are all the same. And we're going to look at the deconstruction of this after we finish looking at a few other issues. And so, according to Scripture, another way of understanding certain descendants of our FACSID is this construct of the bad boys. The descendants of our FACSID are the wayward ones. This is essentially the name of this particular collective that identifies as or has been identified as the descendants of our FACSID. And so with respect to the bad boys, when you look in Scripture, what is indicated is that this is a collective that is simply not going to do right. These individuals are identified as naughty or errant, or disobedient, wicked, malicious, rebellious. There are a number of constructs that are not flattering, that are attached to this particular collective. What's interesting, however, is that things have been structured that result in these entities being elevated. And so in Scripture, they are identified as bad boys. But in terms of history, they have been reformulated to be put on a pedestal. And so you see many people wanting to identify according to this moniker because of the accolades that go along with the construct. And so these descendants of our FACSID have a name that suggests the bad boys. However, there has been a reformulation wherein they have been presented to the world as the good boys. Now, this isn't completely the fault of the descendants of our FACSID or the individuals who identify as the descendants of our FACSID, because many people can read the Scripture and so they can see for themselves what the Scripture is actually saying about the entities. And it's up to them to then formulate their understanding of what Scripture is actually saying about the essence of the people that are being described, these descendants of our FACSID. And so we're going to delve into it. And also, what you are encouraged to do is think about not only what Scripture is saying about these descendants of our FACSID, but what is history also saying about the descendants? What's in a name? Apparently everything. With respect to the collective that we are looking at, these bad boys, the name of the bad boys is essentially trespass, convert, and transgress. Yes, that's the meaning of the name. If you are not currently aware of the meaning of Eber or Aber or Ibri or Abar, the name essentially means trespass. Yes, trespass. What do we mean by trespass? When you look at the basic dictionary definition of trespass, you see Eber right there. Trespass means to pass over. How often have you heard that about the construct or the name of Eber? It means passing across, sort of going through something, passing over something. That is the essence of trespass. And this is the essence of the name Eber. Not only does Aber mean trespass, it also means transgress. And you see this in the essence of the name. And we're going to look very specifically at the name so you can see it very clearly for yourself in terms of the translation, in terms of the meaning. And so this construct of transgress, the dictionary definition of it, is to infringe or go beyond the bounds. You will frequently, if you've been looking at the name Eber before, you will see that it repetitively means go beyond. Now, people can come up with all sorts of meanings for go beyond or what this go beyond was supposed to be about. But the essence of the name Aber is go beyond. And typically, and in scripture, this construct of go beyond has to do with committing an offense, transgressing the law. You see this in the history in terms of the narrative in scripture. There is a repeated narrative of transgression. Every chapter, transgression. Every book, a transgression is indicated. And when you look at the history of Eber or Aber, what you see is a long-standing history of transgression, true to the name. And when you look at the translation of this construct of transgress, you see that in the English, and it translates to sin in the Hebrew. So now let's look at the name Eber or Aber. So at 5677 Strong's in the Hebrew, you see Eber. This is interesting because there is no real word Hebrew in the Old Testament. This essentially is one of the transliterations of that construct. And so again, that creates even more confusion because people are looking for that particular name in terms of history. But when you see that the other way of saying this is Apiru, Habiru, and Hapiru, it becomes more clear. So we see at 5677 Aber, and it means, just as we've been saying, to pass over, to cross. Now, this sounds very benign on the surface, but as you can see, it means something more than simply passing over anything or crossing over anything. It really is about this construct of transgression. And here, if we look at Strong's Hebrew 5674, we see Abar. And so the pronunciation is slightly different. It's the same word. And so here you see Abar is to pass over, to cross, to go through, to transgress. This is Aber's or Eber's name. This is the meaning of it. This is what it means to be Eber, according to this definition. And here again, you see Abar means pass over or through something, transgressing or violating. Now, often when you hear about this construct of Aber or Abar, it's in reference to a deliverance theme. And so, therefore, it obscures what else is going on with respect to this name. And so, there's often a focus on Abar, referring to the crossing of the Red Sea, the Jordan River, this idea of deliverance from slavery. And so, therefore, that becomes the focus. But the essence of the name is not simply limited to that, to this rescuing, salvation, escape dynamic. It's also related to the construct of invading. And here you can see an additional transliteration coming out of the Assyrian with Apiru. And here you can see this dynamic of flooding and invasion with respect to Abar. And so when you look at scripture and you think about history, you can see how the name fits. And so it goes on to indicate that with respect to Abar, it also means to emigrate, to leave one's territory or city. Even when you saw what took place as Europe was being emptied out and people were being dispersed, those individuals were being deported. They were immigrating. They were being alienated from their own homelands. And then they passed into the lands of another. And so that whole idea of alien, or alienage, alienating, that's also a part of this construct of Eber. And you see that with respect to Abraham. The narrative about Abraham is about Abraham being an alien. And so you see here, it also indicates alter, that's that conversion that we talked about. Beyond, bring over, that's also a part of a pattern. Okay, so it's not only the going over or crossing over or going beyond a boundary, there's also the dynamic of bringing things into other spaces, bringing people into other spaces, crossing over into other people's spaces and consuming other people's things. And so it goes on to also indicate that there is this idea of overcoming. So there's a conquest element to this construct of Eber. There is quite a bit that goes into this Aber, Aber construct. And so you see the traditional constructs such as, going beyond, passing through, passing over. But then you see some very interesting oddities. You see lay, metal, overrun, make partition, perish, provoke to anger, rage, raiser of taxes, remove, transgress again, and be wrath. And here we are at Strong's 5676. We see a bear, which is also a ver. So that B and that V are completely interchangeable. You can say one or the other. It's going to be the same word. And so here you see with a bear or a ver, region beyond, other side, across. And here you see this interesting addition in terms of what a bear or a ver means. It means transgress and trespass. but it also means, interestingly, west. Perhaps that's where that saying, "Go west, young man," came from. Okay, so you see additional transliterations with Ebru, Ebertu, and Ebertan, all of them essentially meaning beyond, going across, region across. And you can see with a variety of the transliterations the same thing with respect to this trespass and transgress. And so here we have Abarim, and this is at 5682 Hebrew Strongs, and it means the same thing, derived from the Hebrew root of avar, okay, with that V, meaning to pass across or pass over. And here you see this reference to crossing over and the land of Canaan. And you see this reference to crossing a boundary with respect to this name, Abarim. And here you see this Abarim being related to the form of Eber, again, trespass and transgress. Now, when we get to 5680, it's very specific about what is being referenced here. So 5680 is this Ibri. And Ibri, the definition of Ibri is Hebrew. It means an Eberite. However, remember, there is no real Eberite, it's Ibri. And again, what do we have here? Trespass and transgress. That is the essence of this name, to cross over, to pass through. At 5681 Strongs in the Hebrew, you see a repeat of this with Ibri. And you see here, again, trespass and transgress. It's a proper masculine name. And here you see with this resource, not only is it referring to this idea of a going over, but metaphorically, the idea of disregarding or violating or breaking a transgression. And here you see a related construct at 1616 Strongs, and it's related to sojourner, meaning essentially stranger, foreigner, alien, a guest. And of course, if you look at the historical narratives in Scripture related to the Ibri, the Aber, the Heber, what you see is a history of this temporary dwelling dynamic. You see this nomadic dynamic going on. And it indicates here, with respect to this construct of the sojourner, that Aber, generally speaking, is considered a temporary dweller, a newcomer with no inherited rights. If you look at the narrative, you see that the rights that are promised are not actually inherited rights. These are rights that have been, according to the narrative, actually taken from another entity that has inherited rights. And so it's the property of one of the brothers being given to another brother. And so the actual inheritance and birthright that goes along with that particular lineage is transferred to a totally different lineage. But of course, this is a part of a pattern also. And so this idea of being a sojourner, an alien, is someone who is not home-born, and they are in a space based upon hospitality. It's interesting here because it indicates that this is technically figurative of the entity known as Yahweh. This is also related to Jacob being in Egypt, where there was hospitality given. Now, of course, the name Abram has quite a narrative that goes along with it. And so at Strong's 87, you see Abram. And Abram, when breaking the word down, it means high father or exalted father or some variation thereof. And it's coming from the word Abiram. But consistent with that Heberu identity, we have Abram or Abiram being related to the construct again of rebellion, and not only rebellion but apostasy, not only apostasy but this idea of divine judgment. Now, what's interesting about that is you will frequently hear individuals who identify as Eber or Aber talking about judgment. There is an extreme focus on judgment. This is interesting because in terms of the law, there's a process before you get to judgment. We don't really hear about the process before judgment. We just hear about the judgment, and a focus on judgment and a focus on appeasement to alleviate judgment. In other words, sacrificing something, an animal, a lamb, a goat, in order to appease the situation and not receive the judgment. But this name also, in addition to meaning going beyond and trespassing and transgressing, is related to the idea of divine judgment. And here you see this additional commentary about the name and historical background. And it indicates here in the biblical narrative, names often carry significant meanings and reflect the character or the destiny of the individuals. And so it goes on to point out that Abiram is a name associated with rebellion and divine judgment. Now, if you are familiar with Betacism, you know that there is the flipping of the B and the V. And this is an example of that. And so you're going to come away with the same dynamic, the same meaning with flipping the V and the B. And in this instance, you don't have Abar or Abar, you have Avar or Avar. And what do you see here? Okay. One of a Turkic people who made incursions in southeastern Europe. And so this Avar, this name is tied to a collective of people who were known for making this very specific type of incursion. And here you see this very interesting word that is an outgrowth of Avar, Abar, very similar to the trespass and the transgress. With respect to avarice, avarice is understood as having a sort of inordinate desire, a craving for something, a greediness, a grasping, consuming. And so that's also what you see in every colonial dynamic. It's somebody who sees something that somebody else has, and then they want it. And in these instances, they figure out ways to dispossess the original owners so that they can possess whatever it is. That is a construct known as, related to, avarice. And again, you see the AVAR as the root of this. When you look at the law, you will also see a similar dynamic with respect to trespass. You can think about individuals perhaps trespassing on your land, or there's also the trespass to chattels. When there is a trespass, just like you see in Scripture, it indicates entering another's property or land without permission. It's that situation where someone is encroaching on someone's privacy or their property interests. Now, with respect to trespass, basically all you need is an actual invasion of the property. You can even cause something else to invade the property. But this idea of trespass is about invasion. And when you see the construct of Eber or Aber, you see that that is the essence of the name. Trespass, invasion, transgress, all of that. And that's the name. Again, this trespass can apply not only to land or property, real property, it also applies to personal property, wherein someone interferes with someone's ownership or possessory interest in a particular piece of property. And when there is substantial and serious interference with that property, or there's destruction of the property, the personal property, then we have another dynamic that's going on. So we have trespass to chattel generally, but when there is a serious and substantial interference, you have what's known as conversion. And this is interesting because historically, you also see this behavioral pattern related to converting. And here you see this construct of transgress in the New Testament in the Greek. And it not only speaks to this idea of going beyond trespassing, but it also very specifically indicates to overstep and also includes overreaching and defrauding. And here you see very specifically that this construct of transgress not only means crossing over or going beyond, but it refers to this idea of rebellion in terms of crossing a boundary. It suggests that it's about a deliberate action of overstepping or transgressing. It's not an accident. And not only is this transgression, trespassing about a deliberate action, but it's also very specifically related to going beyond, overstepping, transgressing the laws and commandments that are in Scripture. And so it's a very violating type of construct. It's a very violating name. This discussion goes on to indicate that this idea of transgression, trespassing, is tied to excessive pride. And here you see this reiteration of this idea of stepping over, going beyond, transgressing again, overstepping limits, to do wrong, and to sin. And so again, this is the essence of the name Eber. And consistent with the Abrahamic narratives, with Abraham or Abram being referred to as an alien or a stranger or a foreigner, it indicates again that this idea of beyond is related to this idea of alien or that which is foreign. It indicates here in terms of the etymology of or belonging to another, not one's own, foreign, strange, another, other, different, and very specifically beyond. Now remember the whole obscuring thing that goes on with these names? Well, there's a very interesting obscurity related to Abiram and Aber and Abar and Abram and Abraham. And it relates to the Bur part of the construct, that preserved part of the construct. And so when we look at constructs or other words or other names, labels, that seem slightly related to Bur, we find a serious relationship. And so another Eber is Barbary. Barbary means foreign lands. It is from the Latin barbaria, meaning foreign country, barbarous, strange, or foreign, related to the Saracen, coming from the Old French barbarie, the Arabic barbar, and Berber. And notably, in this case, Barbary refers to those who are beyond Egypt. Okay. So it goes on to talk about something very interesting related to Berber and Barbar. That's going to take us to Babylon. And so this is going to link Heberu and his home, Babylon. So you see here, it indicates Barbara is another way of saying to babble confusedly. Also, this is in the Greek Barbaria. Barbaria is the land of the barbarians. Other names for Barbaria, Barbary. Remember the Barbary coast. Eber's influence is far reaching. Okay. So here you see this continuation of this construct of barbarian. So it indicates here earlier, this is barbar, a person who is not a Roman and not a Greek. However, you will find that there's a relationship, of course, between Heberu and the Greeks and the Romans. And so you see again this Berber, that's the land space, Berber, Barbary. So you see again Saracen, barbarian, strange, foreign, unintelligible speech, meaning the speech of a foreigner. And this is interestingly tied to Babylon. And here you see again this reference to barbarian being a native of the Barbary coast. And in many situations, it's referring to this idea of someone being a wild or a rude individual, a savage. And this, of course, is interesting because when Berber Iberia landed in the Americas, the identity put on to the people in the Americas was this savage identity. And in many ways, this relates to another Freudian defense mechanism referred to as projective identification, and we can talk about that. And here you see these references to barbarian suggesting an uncivilized people, basically someone who's neither Greek nor Roman. You see this reference to inhumanity and cruelty. And that, of course, relates to another entity that we recently talked about, this idea of a barbarous act. What's also interesting about barbaric is that according to this etymology, it expresses the characteristic of love of the barbarians for adornment, magnificence, and noise. And here you see this reiteration of this idea of barbaric relating to uncultured, uncivilized, unpolished, foreign, strange, outlandish, and alien in this particular situation. And also, again, that idea of neither being Roman nor Greek. And here we see the construct of Berber. And it indicates here that Berber is the Arabic name for the people living in the mountains and deserts of North Africa, west of Egypt. Again, Also, again, related to barbaros, barbary, barbarian. And so while you had the Iberians, the Siberians, the Tiberians, all of them, Hibernians, you had all of them in Europe on the other side of the water. Then down below, you had Berber, the Berberians. Okay. So same people, essentially. Same people, same name, same meaning, same construct going on here. Now we see when looking at this translation, this bar relating to this idea of being wild, but again, being a barbarian, which is a trespasser, a transgressor, one who goes beyond. Notably, there is a relationship between Iber and Aber and Ibri and Abar and Abram and Berber and Barbary and Babel. Remember the indication about the unintelligible speech? And so not being able to understand what someone else is saying, or someone not being able to communicate in a way that another person can understand what they are saying. That's that unintelligible speech. It's also referred to as babbling. And so you see here with respect to Babel that there's something known as a babbler. And in Greek, this is known as barbaros. And what do we have for Babylon? We have, which means the gate of the gods. We have BABIRU. And so the old Persian form of BABIRU is the same as Babylon. And so essentially you have Hapiru, Apiru, Habiru being tied to BABIRU. What we also see with respect to the Chaldee, this brings us back to the Chaldee, is that we are talking about essentially the same people yet again. The Chaldee are the people of Babylon. So you knew this was coming, right? Okay. So who do we have as the North African Berber? And that would be the Moors. This is one of the races dwelling in Barbary. These are the Berbers. Also, these individuals are inhabitants of Mauritania. And so some of this identity has also been obscured by referring to the Berbers, the Moors, those of Mauritania as Negro and Muslim, because essentially they are Berber, Barbary, Aber, Aver, Abarim, all of that. They are right along with them. And here you see additional information related to the relationship between the Moors and the Berbers, Barbary, Mauritania, the Ibers, the Abers, the Ibris. So you see in the Greek this barbaroi again, suggesting all of the people that are not Greek, specifically the Medes and the Persians. However, there's also an indication that, according to the etymology here, the Romans were technically the barbaroi. And this will allow you to see better what's being conserved and giving rise to this burr. And so you can see here that the letters B and R are conserved. That means also that V and R are also conserved. And so when you look up top, you see Abram, and you see that BR, and then you see the Haibri, which looks just like Habiru, meaning the Hebrew. You see the B and the R also conserved. And here you see these Arphaxad, Eber manifestations throughout time and space, across regions beyond. You see Iberians, Liberians, Aberians, Hibernians, Iberians, Siberians, and Tiberians. And here's another notation related to the Hapiru, Habiru, Apiru people. This is a term that, according to Britannica, was applied by the Egyptians to other people or social groups who were of foreign origin. And so when you look at the construct of Aber, Eber, Abram, you see that the name essentially is indicating foreigner. And the Egyptians, who are in scripture referred to as Mizraim, those individuals were referring to this collective of people as Habiru or Apiru. And so you see the collective of people given this name by the Egyptians, and it coincides with the actual names that we see in the Hebrew. And so it indicates here that many scholars feel that among the Hapiru were the original Hebrews. Now that's quite a large contingent of people that have as their essence the construct of going beyond, trespassing, and transgressing. And when we look at history, that collective, this is a large collective we're talking about now, that collective tends to be on the move. And to ask the collective to not be on the move would be asking the collective, this large global contingent, to not be who Scripture says they are. And so what you also see here with respect to Seth or Set, that Seth is related to the idea of the trespass, the transgression. That is the essence of Set, in addition to the lay Set foundation essence of Set's name. And so what you might have also noted in scripture and reviewing the narratives related to Eber or Ibri or Aber, Abarim, you might have noted that not only are these narratives about transgression related to land and property and crossing over and all of that, but there are multiple narratives about Eber seeking to go beyond nature, to transcend natural laws, to take on, that's where you see this taking on of these godlike statuses, this deification dynamic. And so there again is this interesting pattern in scripture of Eber or Aber attempting to do that which is supernatural. And finally, it's interesting to note that the entity in scripture that is identified as trespass, as transgression, the bad boys, it's interesting to note that there is also a culture and philosophy among the Berbers, the barbarians, the Aber, the Abarim, the Ibri, Iberians, the list goes on there. There is a culture, a philosophy of the sacrifice, There is a culture and philosophy related to atonement for sin. This is interesting again because that's the essence of the name. The essence of the name is transgression, suggesting, according to the sacrifice philosophy, that there is a never ending need for this sacrifice process. Interestingly, also, the sacrifice involves something that didn't do anything wrong, that sacrificial lamb. And you see this in both the Old Testament and most notably, you see it in the New Testament. And finally, what we see in scripture related to the bad boys is that the bad boys are not going to do right. You see this pattern repeatedly in scripture related to the bad boys. And the bad boys are constantly chastised for refusing to do right. The bad boys are constantly admonished for refusing to do what is right, according to scripture. And then you see not only are the bad boys being bad boys, but they like to take the show on the road. And so the bad boys have been a major part of empire building around the world, both in scripture and throughout history. And so this expectation that the bad boys are somehow going to one day do right is inconsistent with scripture narrative and inconsistent with the reality that has been presented.